On the 26th of September 1983, a Soviet military officer named Stanislav Petrov was sitting alone in a bunker outside Moscow when the most important alarm in human history went off. It was 12:14 inches the morning. Petrov was the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, the Soviet Union's nuclear early warning facility. His job was simple in theory and impossible in practice. If the facility's satellites detected an incoming American nuclear missile, he had to pick up a phone and report it to his superiors. They would then notify the Soviet leadership, who would have minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike before the incoming missiles hit. Petrov was not the one who would make that decision. He was the one who would start the chain that led to it, which meant that on the night of the 26th of September 1983, when the alarm went off and the screen in front of him showed an incoming American intercontinental ballistic missile, Stanislav Petrov was the first link in a chain that could end human civilization. He reported it as a system malfunction. He was right. And for that decision, which took less than 5 minutes and saved every person alive on Earth, he was reprimanded. To understand why Petrov did what he did, and why his country punished him for it, you have to understand the world as it existed in the fall of 1983. Not as we remember it now, softened by hindsight and the knowledge that the Cold War ended without a nuclear exchange, but as it felt at the time to the people living through it who had no idea how it was going to end. The year 1983 was, by the assessment of multiple historians and intelligence analysts who have since reviewed the classified records, the most dangerous year of the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The two superpowers had spent the previous decade building nuclear arsenals of almost incomprehensible scale. The United States had deployed new Pershing II missiles in Western Europe, which could reach Moscow in under 10 minutes. The Soviet leadership, aging and increasingly paranoid, had convinced itself that the Americans were planning a first strike, not as a theoretical possibility, as an operational reality that they believed was being actively planned. Soviet intelligence had been tasked with watching for specific indicators of American pre-launch preparation. Every NATO military exercise was analyzed for signs that it might be cover for an actual attack. The atmosphere inside the Soviet military establishment in the fall of 1983 was not one of cold professional calculation. It was one of genuine fear. 3 weeks before Petrov sat down at his post on September 26, the Soviets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian passenger aircraft that had strayed into Soviet airspace. 269 people were killed. The international reaction was furious. President Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and the incident hardened positions on both sides. The Soviet leadership interpreted Western outrage as evidence of hostile intent. The Americans interpreted Soviet behavior as evidence of dangerous irrationality. Both sides were watching each other through a lens of maximum suspicion. This was the world on the night of the 26th of September 1983, when Stanislav Petrov reported for duty at Serpukhov 15. Petrov was 44 years old. He had been in the Soviet military for his entire adult life. He was an engineer by training, which meant he understood the early warning system not just as a set of procedures, but as a piece of technology with specific capabilities and specific failure modes. He had not originally been scheduled to work that night. He was covering for a colleague. He sat down at his post, went through his checks, and settled in for what he expected to be a routine shift. At 12:14 a.m., the alarm went off. The satellite system was called Oko, which means eye in Russian. It was designed to detect the heat signature of an intercontinental ballistic missile launch from American territory. When it triggered, a single word appeared on Petrov's screen in large red letters, the Russian word for launch. Then the system reported the number of incoming missiles, 1. Petrov looked at the screen. He had about 5 minutes before the missile, if it was real, would reach Soviet territory and explode. The protocol was clear. He was supposed to pick up the phone and report an incoming strike to his superiors. They would then notify the Soviet General Staff, who would notify the Soviet leadership, who would make the decision about whether to launch a retaliatory strike before the incoming missiles hit. The entire chain was designed to move fast, because fast was the only option. Missiles travel faster than deliberation. Petrov did not pick up the phone. He stood there, looking at the screen, and he thought. He thought about what he knew about the American nuclear doctrine. A first strike would not consist of one missile. If the Americans were launching a nuclear attack, they would launch everything simultaneously, because a single missile gives the other side time to retaliate. One missile made no strategic sense. He thought about the technology in front of him. The OCO satellite system was new. It had not been in operation long enough to have a fully established track record. He knew from his engineering background that new systems had failure modes that weren't always predictable. He thought about the time. 14 inches. The morning was an unusual time for a nuclear launch, though he acknowledged to himself that this reasoning was thin, and nuclear war does not observe business hours. The system upgraded the alert. Now it was showing not one missile, but 5. Petrov later described this moment as the one where he felt the ground shift under him. 5 missiles was harder to explain as a malfunction. 5 missiles was closer to what a real first strike might look like, though still far fewer than a genuine all-out attack would involve. He had perhaps 2 minutes left before he had to make a decision. His colleagues in the room were watching him. Some of them were shouting. The noise level was rising. The alarm was still going. He reported it as a system malfunction. He picked up the phone to his superiors, and instead of saying the words that would have started the chain toward nuclear retaliation, he said that the alert was a false alarm caused by a system error. He said this before he could prove it. He said it based on reasoning that he himself acknowledged was not conclusive. He said it because the alternatives were worse. If he was wrong and the missiles were real, the Soviet retaliatory strike would happen slightly later than it would have if he had followed protocol. That was the cost of being wrong in one direction. If he was right and the missiles were not real and he had followed protocol, the cost of being wrong in the other direction was a nuclear exchange that neither side wanted and that would kill hundreds of millions of people. The math was not complicated. The courage required to act on that math, alone, in a room full of people screaming at you with 2 minutes on the clock, was something else entirely. He was right. The OCO satellite system had malfunctioned. A rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had been misread by the satellite sensors as the heat signature of missile launches. There were no American missiles. There was no attack. The most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War, outside of Cuba, had been caused by sunlight and clouds and one man's refusal to follow a protocol that would have ended the world. The Soviet military investigated. They confirmed that Petrov had made the correct call. They also noted that he had violated procedure by not immediately reporting the alert as a genuine strike, and that his written log of the incident contained errors made in the chaos of the moment. He was reprimanded. He was not promoted. He was transferred to a less sensitive position. He was told, in the way that military institutions tell people things without saying them directly, that what had happened that night was not something that needed to be discussed. He retired from the military in 1984, 1 year after the incident. He took a job as an engineer at the research institute that had developed the early warning system. He lived in a small apartment in Fryazevo, a suburb of Moscow. He did not talk about what had happened. The Soviet government did not acknowledge it. The incident was classified. For the next decade, nobody outside a small circle of Soviet military officials knew that on the 26th of September 1983, one man had looked at a screen showing 5 incoming nuclear missiles and decided, on the basis of reasoning rather than procedure, that the screen was wrong. The world found out by accident. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Archives began to open. A retired Soviet general named Yuri Votintsev, who had been Petrov's commander on the night of the 26th of September 1983, gave an interview in the mid-1990s in which he described the incident. The story was picked up by journalists. Petrov, now living in retirement, began to receive calls from reporters. He did not understand why people were interested. From his perspective, he had done the logical thing. The situation had presented a problem. He had analyzed the available information and reached a conclusion. The conclusion had been correct. He did not think of it as heroism. He thought of it as engineering. The world did not agree. By the early 2000s, Petrov had become internationally famous. He was invited to the United Nations. He received awards from organizations in multiple countries. A documentary was made about him. A German filmmaker produced a feature-length movie. He traveled to the United States, where he was received by people who told him he had saved their lives, their children's lives, their grandchildren's lives. He accepted these acknowledgments with a kind of bewildered politeness. He was not a man who had been trained to receive gratitude. He was a man who had been trained to solve problems. In 2013, he was awarded the Dresden Peace Prize. In his acceptance speech, he said that he did not consider himself a hero because heroes are supposed to know what they are doing. He had not known. He had made the best decision he could with the information available. The fact that it turned out to be correct did not make it anything more than that. He died on the 19th of May 2017 in his apartment in Fryazevo. He was 77 years old. His death was not announced immediately. His son discovered it weeks later. By the time the news reached the international press, he had been dead for almost 3 months. The man who saved the world died alone in a suburb of Moscow, and the world did not notice for 3 months. His file in the Soviet military archive still carries the reprimand from 1983. The citation notes that Petrov failed to follow correct reporting procedures during an alert on the night of September 26. It does not mention what would have happened if he had. Thanks for watching this one all the way through. If you enjoyed it, leave a like. It helps the channel more than you would think. Subscribe if you want to see what comes next. See you tomorrow.